Good morning, everybody. I'm Jackie Lauer, and I am your service associate this morning. Glad to see you here on this beautiful day, and hopefully to the beginning of many, many beautiful days. We're going to reflect on our third principle this morning. Spiritual growth isn't about a vertical ascent to heaven, but about growth in every dimension at once. It's spirituality in 3D. Growth in spirit doesn't measure one's proximity to a God above, but rather the spaciousness of one's own soul, its volume, its capacity, its size. We need souls that can take in the world in all its complexity and diversity, yet still maintain our integrity. And we need souls that can love and be in relationship with all of this complexity. Instead of fight or flight, we need a spiritual posture of embrace. That was from Reverend Rob Hardy's The All Souls Church Unitarian in Washington, D.C. The opening words is number 580, The Task of the Religious Community by Mark Morrison Reed. The central task of the religious community is to unveil the bonds that bind each to all. There is a connectedness, a relationship discovered amid the particulars of our own lives and the lives of others. Once felt, it inspires us to act for justice. It is the church that assures us that we are not struggling for justice on our own, but as members of a larger community. The religious community is essential, for alone our vision is too narrow to see all that must be seen, and our strength too limited to do all that must be done. Together, our vision widens and our strength is renewed. The opening hymn, number 300.
With heart and mind and voice and hand, may we this time and place transcend, to make our purpose understood. A mortal search for mortal good, a firm commitment to the goal of justice, freedom, peace for all. A mind that's free to seek the truth, a mind that's free in age and youth, to choose a path no threat impedes, wherever light of conscience leads. Our martyrs died so we could be a church where every mind is free. A heart that's kind, a heart whose search makes love the spirit of our church, where we can grow and each one's gift is sanctified and spirits lift, where every door is open wide for all who choose to step inside.
Our transitional words are on page 488. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field frozen with snow. Langston Hughes. Our program this morning is Founders Day. It's our own Sarah Laughlin, and I want to thank Sarah also for choosing the words and the songs that are so appropriate and fit in with the speaking today. Sarah always has an interesting perspective. She's a fantastic teacher, in the church and outside of the church. And so we always appreciate her being here. So Sarah, I will turn the podium over to you.
I changed my thoughts about Founders Day just midweek. I spoke to Sylvia at the last minute when she was doing the calling about the program, and I was, of course, Founders Day is in January 9th, 1955, but with us not meeting on that day last winter, we have some thoughts about our founders today. While I was sorting out some things last weekend in my ongoing, everlasting attempt to downsize my house, I was going through a stack of old UUA Unitarian Universalist World. And this is unfortunately proof if you don't throw things away, maybe some point you'll have a reason that they were there. And of course, when I throw away a magazine, I have to see, well, are there good color images for my students at the high school to use for collages? Or is there an article that wasn't important to me before that now has meaning? And so flipping through this, I found a page here, and this is from the summer of, not 19, we're at least in 2000s here, 2018. And it lists the 7 principles. And then right below, with equal attention, are 7 sources. And my thought was to myself, 7 principles I know all about, but 6 sources, I'm not quite familiar with 6 sources. And maybe since then, Sylvia's had some thoughts about that, but in my mind, Sylvia did ring a big bell with her, and I thought, well, I've been missing something. What do I need to educate myself about? And so maybe this morning some of the things that I'll mention are things that you're aware of, but maybe, Grace, you'll be like me and be hearing about these things fresh. And unfortunately, sometimes I feel like I know so many things, I forget what I know, and so it's fun to re-explore and relearn. 6 sources, what about 6 sources? I, of course, had to Google to learn more about this, like how long, and they're of course they are, in the front of the hymnal. Of course they are. Thank you for making me even feel better about this. So anyway, I, had to Google this to find out more about it, and I still have this vision. I wish I could remember the student, but I remember at Otter Creek many years ago when I was teaching art there, we were discussing something that I thought that I would like to know more about, and one of my students said, well, Miss Laughlin, you can just Google it. And for those of you who remember when that was not always an immediate resource there, so quickly available. I did find that on the UUA website there was a listing of these 6 sources, and I'll mention them in a moment. But following that list on the UUA's website was a statement by a minister, Kathleen Rowlands. Throughout history, we've moved to the rhythms and mystery and wonder, prophecy, wisdom, teachings from ancient and modern times, and nature herself. We have had a lot of sources that we have drawn from. I was curious about these sources, and I looked up, of all things, the bylaws. Who goes looking for bylaws on purpose? But I thought, this is something I don't know about, just exactly, if this is in the bylaws. It seemed to imply that it was. And on the Unitarian Universalist Association bylaws and rules, as amended through February 14th, 2022, in case anybody's interested. And I understand, Dottie, and John, that in 2023, these are to be looked at again, particularly this section relating to the principles and purpose, with the thought perhaps of adding in that 8th principle. But currently, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Still in the bylaws of importance, right there in that same section, right underneath the bylaw, or the principles, is this. The living tradition which we share draws from many sources. Direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. Words and deeds of prophetic people. In my 2018 version, it said men and women, and has been amended to read people, which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. Wisdom from the world's religions, which inspire us in all our ethical and spiritual life. Jewish and Christian teachings, which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Humanist teachings, which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. Spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. Ending with, grateful for the religious pluralism which enriches and ennobles our faith, we are inspired to deepen our understanding and expand our vision. As free congregations, we enter into this covenant promising to one another our mutual trust and support. And that's the end of the bylaws section. I spent some time thinking about those 6 sources. Basically, direct experience, which we all are absorbing experience daily, even when we are not conscious of it. Words and deeds of prophetic people that have influenced us. Wisdom from the world's religion. Jewish and Christian particular teaching, which call upon us to respond to God's love. Humanist teachings. Spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions. And coupled with those, together they move us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life, challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love, inspire us in our ethical and spiritual life, call us to love our neighbors as ourselves, counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. And lastly, instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. I thought about our local founders, the people that were here in Terre Haute who founded this congregation or who were involved in this congregation over the many years. I thought about how did they, as our local founders and their successors who were here after the founding, how have they become a source themselves for us? Initially, as some of you know, there was a Universalist church in Terre Haute that was founded in the early 1850s and was a vibrant congregation downtown, rose to a great success and then dwindled as organizations sometimes do, and closed by the time 1900 came about, and had a very large building at the site where Holman Center is on 8th Street. There also was a Universalist church that was an old congregation that stayed intact for many years, but I think it was in the 90s that the church at Hudsonville, Illinois, across the river and a little bit south closed. I've thought about our church today, and think about our congregation here and how they might not recognize what we do here today. It's very, very different than the Unitarian and Universalist churches in the 1800s. Both were Protestant denominations, and they did merge in the 1960s, but their roots, the core of their church perhaps was much different than what we might consider to be the core of ours. One of the things that we have here this morning that I placed out here, this silver container that looks like it might be a cake carrier, was a gift to us from the Hudsonville Universalist Church when they did close and had to give up their building. For us, I know at the time when we received that for a gift, we thought, what are we going to do with that? But the saver of things said, that's important to them, and it's very symbolic of our denomination and what our roots were and how we came about. I'm always aware that Dottie might correct me on some of these things, so I always welcome her thoughts about this, but my understanding about Universalism, one of the root thoughts in Protestantism was that the congregation should be able to share in communion and not just the priest. Does that sound sort of okay? Okay. So we have this object here that was treasured by the Hudsonville organization, church, and I find it, it's taking up some shelf in the storage room, but I think it's an important reminder about where we are and where we've come. The current group that we have has expanded our ideas beyond what the early Universalists and Unitarians would have done. There was in 1954, when there was no Unitarian or no Universalist group in Terre Haute, there was the idea from the Universalists and the Unitarians that they both wanted to do some extension and get a group started in Terre Haute. And it sort of melted down, the groups sort of merged together, and the extension efforts were sort of merged into the responsibility of one person who was a Reverend Don Thompson, who put an ad in the newspaper in 1954 in October inviting people to come to an exploratory meeting to see if they might be interested in this. And this little tiny ad said this: Terre Haute Liberal Fellowship, quote, in quotation, Unitarian Universalist, not quotation, parentheses, I know the difference, now being organized. First meeting, Sunday, October 24th, 2:30 p.m., Cooper Room, YMCA, Reverend Donald Thompson, P.O. Box 477. Bus Lindholm was one of the people that was reading these ads and who would become a charter member of this group when the charter was signed in 1955. In his writings, he remembered that the word liberal got his attention, was attracted to that, but what repelled him was the word reverend, though he came to be more tolerant of it later. A key source of those early congregations was that source relating to the Jewish and Christian teachings, which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. That would have been the core of that was the source that would have been their core. By the time in the mid-50s that congregations were sort of taking a new look at things, something was a little different. There was this idea that there was something beyond what had been the traditional Jewish Christian teachings. When Buss said that he had responded positively toward liberal and negatively toward reverend, he said that in a couple of articles later, there was the announcement that the topic on that Sunday was going to be the place for religion in a scientific age. And Buss told his wife, I think we need to go down there. I think they may need some help. Understanding the community at the time in the mid-50s. A key source, I will suggest, that came to be of the early congregation here was that key principle, or that key source, humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. When I think of a member that might have been an example to me of that particular source, it was a man named Lyle Schmidt. Lyle was a charter member of the organization in 1955, and sometimes when I stand up here, I still see some people in the audience that aren't here. And Lyle used to sit back on the back, so his long, tall legs would have some room to stretch, and also, I think, to sort of separate himself from us a bit sometimes. Lyle was a chemist, and he lived over in Marshall, Illinois, and to humanize him a bit, I will suggest he never married. He was very tall and handsome and gray hair all of his life when I knew him, very tall, and probably, I won't say probably, the most eligible bachelor in Marshall, Illinois. Driving sports cars but being a wonderful human being, but at the heart of his source of inspiration was science. When we changed our name here to include the term congregation, I think Lyle was a little put off by that and thought that was going a little farther away from the humanist tradition that he was interested in. But I think of Lyle on occasion and that he was an inspiration to me. When the group grew a little larger, it was they needed a building to function in, and a little room at the YMCA at Poplar and 6th Street wasn't, sufficient. They acquired a building on 900 South Center Street. Jane will always, is it okay? Because, in Louisville there was a 900 next door. They bought a house to function in, and we're growing, and people were responding to this. And when I think of that building and what happened to there, though a person that I did not meet has influenced me indirectly, using that key source, words and deeds of prophetic people which challenge us to confront powers and evils, structures of evil, with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. For some of you that have heard me speak, this is a repetition of what you already know. But for those of you who don't, I think it's immensely important that there was a person who founded, essentially guided this organization and was a significant person. When the group was having its meetings on South Center Street, Reverend Thompson felt that the group was on its feet and he had done his job as getting the congregation started and he could move on. In the 1960s, early 1960s, the civil rights movement was of great significance. Some of us thought we would have succeeded by now, but that job seems to perhaps be endless. But when Reverend Thompson left, he became very active in the civil rights movement. He served as an extension member for a First Unitarian Church, now Unitarian Universalist Church, in Jackson, Mississippi. The church had been founded in 1951 and was sort of struggling, and he was sent in to see what help he could be. He settled in Jackson in 1963, and this was shortly before the assassination of civil rights activist Medgar Evers. If you know about civil rights history, this was a significant event. After Evers was killed, Thompson volunteered to serve in some capacity to fill a position that Evers had had on the Mississippi Human Rights Council. The First Unitarian Church of Jackson was the first integrated church in Mississippi. And under his leadership, the congregation started its first Head Start program for underprivileged children in the state, and it too was integrated. The actions of Reverend Thompson caught the attention of the Ku Klux Klan that were not very happy with this happening in their state, this man coming in from out of state, this white man coming in from out of state and welcoming black people to participate in his programs. One evening in 1965, while walking to his apartment after having escorted a black church member home, Reverend Thompson was shot in the back. Now, he survived, but he carried 6 bullets in his body until his death many years later. He was determined to continue his work, but death threats, not against him so much, but against members of his congregation. He felt it would be necessary for the safety of his congregation if he moved. And he did die, 20 years later in Boston at the age of 79. But when I think about a prophet within this group, though I never met him myself, I've thought about him so much and read about him that I feel I almost have known him. And I certainly feel that through his words and deeds, this source, he challenged us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. The group had an opportunity to move from that building on South Center Street to a lovely building that is on South 6th Street at the corner of 6th and Swan. Attorneys have the building now. When I'm thinking of words and deeds, I still have to think about another example that I will probably, I guess now, always carry with me. And Lauren, I'm glad you're here now. I'm going to talk about Mama. One of the best stories that I have taken away from this congregation wasn't the best situation, but when Lauren's mother passed away in 1987, I believe, there was a memorial service at our building on South 6th Street, and it was crowded. It was standing room only. It was shoulder to shoulder. And I gave up my seat and went to the landing above the staircase. I could hear, but I couldn't see what was going on. And at a time in the service when there was a welcoming for people to share stories, I recognized a voice coming up the staircase. There was this high, intense voice with a Romanian accent that was the one and only Eva Kor. If you're new to the community, Eva Kor was a Holocaust survivor and founder of the Candles Museum. Eva told a story, and if Eva respects you, I think that's a big thing. And Eva told a story. I don't recall where they were. I don't recall what city. I believe it was out of town. But they were walking together somewhere on the sidewalk, and they spied a poster or a sign with anti-Semitic comments on the sign. Now, of course, that was significant to Ava, but also, though a UU, Sylvia had Hebrew background. And Sylvia was determined to get that sign. And Ava, as I recall the story, said, no, you'll get in trouble, and it's offense, and no. For Ava to not take it, but of course, Ava was this tall, and Sylvia was my height. Sylvia climbed the fence, snatched down that sign, climbed back over the fence, and then the two went down the sidewalk. I think about that as being an example of how many times we have looked at something and said, well, I ought to do that, but. Those moments when we're inspired, like, no, I'm going to do this. I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to take action on this, and by my words and deeds, I'm going to make a difference. And I think that Alaska lady made a difference on that day, and Ava Kor reminded it. One of those sources is spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with rhythms of nature. All of these things, there have been programs that have woven this into our services. But there was a lady that I met when we were having our services on South 6th Street, and her name was Lois Orman. Now, if you have never met Lois Orman, she was a very modest person. She was sort of short, and she wore her graying hair swept over with a barrette and then down. And she always was very simply and plainly dressed. And I really didn't know her very well. She had moved here with her husband, who was a professor at ISU and was an active member in the congregation. But I didn't really feel I got to know her until her memorial service. I had never been at a service where there were artifacts of a person spread out on a table. And she died in, I looked it up, of course you can Google anything, 1995. And at the time, I had certainly been to services where there were photographs of people, but not of their belongings. And there was a long table that had boots. There were hiking boots. There were fishing boots. There were snow boots. There may have been snowshoes, but there were a collection of these things and other things that she had worn on her outdoor activities, her outdoor explorations, her walk in the country. They lived on a dead-end road south of Riley, a very private little area out there, and I can imagine her. I stood there thinking, gosh, that is really cool. And it was an inspiration to me to think about how at the time, I was very involved with lots of board meetings and activities with the Arts Council, and I didn't seem to have time. I felt I didn't have time for those walks and those outdoor experts, and I was getting too far away from my, at least in my mind, that heart of me that belongs out there in nature. When when Lois passed away, after the service, we all went down to the Wabash River, and there had been permission given for her ashes to be strewn in the river. And we walked down a little platform that was out there, and we put Lois's ashes in the river. We eventually, of course, moved here. And we have this home, and who knows how long we'll be here. Maybe we'll be here for 100, who knows what our history will be. But we'll be, people like us will be the ones who determine what that future is going to be. I think in terms of weaving in, thinking about these sources, one of those sources is wisdom from the world's religions, which inspire us in our ethical and spiritual life. And I think that we've talked a lot about these things from the podium here, but there have been some events that we have had that there perhaps is not one individual, though I will say perhaps Kathy McGuire has been an instigator in bringing the Tibetan monks here, not to speak on a Sunday, but to have weekend activities and demonstrate their arts and their philosophy so that we can engage with them and participate in that way. Not that Kathy is the only one who, oh. Well, she's the one who gave me the pictures. But of course you did, okay. Then also about how Muslims and cookies. Were you an instigator of that? Okay, Kathy did that, okay. But I think we can be very proud that we have, of course, COVID interrupted that as it did many things, but that we have opened our doors here to have an opportunity, not just talking at a podium, but having people be able to sit together and have exchanges about our commonalities as well as our specialness that distinguish us. So, the one of those 6 sources that I really couldn't hone down in my experience to think about who had inspired me in this way was direct experience of the transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. I couldn't identify any one individual, but I think maybe it's just all of us all together that inspire me here about what we all do together. In the future, we may be those sources for other people. We may be the sources of inspiration for others that will think back maybe on a day in 20 years or 50 years or even 100 years in some writing or some old picture in the archives, that there will be something that we will have done that will have served as a source for others who follow us.
Our closing hymn, if you would please join me, is number 318.
We would be one as now we join in singing our hymn of love to pledge ourselves. loss is true. We would be one in living for each other, to show to all a new community. We would be one in building for tomorrow, a nobler world than we have known today. We would be one in searching for that meaning which binds our hearts and points us on our way. As one we pledge ourselves to greater service, with love and justice strive to make us free.
Our closing words are 492. Fragile and rooted. See a blossom in your mind's eye. Allow it to fill the interior of your imagination. Greater perfection of form in nature cannot be imagined. With inward gaze, absorb each wondrous fluted petal. Slide down its humid surface until you drop as the dew into its velvety core. Immerse your senses in this safe chamber. Such fragile beauty gives impulse to weep. Slowly reverse the journey. As you ascend the shaft toward wider light, turn your imagination around and around to see its many facets. Stored within is the memory of all flowers. Marvel that this creation, while utterly fragile, yet undaunted, boldly buds forth, turning resolutely toward the sun. We too shimmer with expectation, exuding our own illumination, color, pulse, and scent. Vulnerable, still we venture our lives courageously toward hope and light, at once fragile and rooted. Carolyn S. Owen Towell.
May the blessings of love rest upon you. May peace abide with you. May God's presence illuminate your heart now and forevermore.
Go in peace, know that you are loved, and that your life is sacred.